You grew up with his face. Maybe it was a painting in the church where you were baptized. Long, light brown hair parted cleanly down the middle. A neat beard, pale skin, eyes the color of shallow water. Calm and distant, and somehow familiar. The way all inherited things feel familiar. Maybe it was the illustrated Bible your parents gave you when you were 8. Maybe it was the small framed print above your grandmother's bed. The one that made her room feel different from all the other rooms in the house. Quieter, more serious. You accepted that face the way you accept a family portrait. You didn't choose it. It was given to you before you had language for the question you might have asked. This is what he looked like. This is the man. What you were never told, that face was assembled over several centuries by artists who had never met anyone who had ever met Jesus. Artists who were, explicitly, working from pagan god imagery, from Greek philosopher portrait conventions, from the visual vocabulary of empire. The face you were given is not a record. It is a decision that someone made for you, centuries before you were born, for reasons that had nothing to do with the truth. And here is the thing that changed everything for me. The earliest surviving image of Jesus, painted within 200 years of the crucifixion, by people far closer to him in time than any Renaissance painter, shows a clean-shaven young man with short Roman hair dressed in a tunic. He looks like any man of his time. He looks nothing like the face on your grandmother's wall. I teach a seminar I've been putting together for about 3 years now. It started as a New Testament history course. It became something else. There's one session I come back to more than any other. I call it simply Images of Jesus. Not theology, not doctrine. Just what people drew and when and why and what they were working from. I project 2 images side by side on the screen. On the left, the Christ Pantocrator. If you've ever seen any Christian icon, you've seen this one. The most reproduced Christian image in human history. Long hair, full beard, direct gaze, gold halo, painted at St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai, 6th century CE. This is the face that 1400 years of Christianity has called Jesus. On the right, a fresco fragment from a church in Dura-Europos, Syria, dated approximately 235 CE. This is the oldest known narrative image of Jesus. A young man, clean-shaven, short hair, Roman tunic. He is healing the paralytic at the pool of Bethesda. The students look at both images. The right one is unfamiliar. Almost always, someone says, "That doesn't look like Jesus." I say, "This is the earlier one. The one on the left was painted 300 years after this one." The room goes quiet. Then I say, "We've been told these are both the same person. They look like different people." They are, in fact, the same person, or rather, the same absence of information filled in differently depending on who needed what and when. I let both images stay on the screen. I don't say anything else. I found that the silence does more than the explanation. Because what I'm watching, when I watch that room go quiet, is the same thing I watched happen inside myself the first time I really looked at that Dura-Europos fresco. The face you were given has a date, it has authors, it has a purpose. And none of those 3 things have anything to do with what Jesus actually looked like. Let me show you something. If you search for a Roman description of Jesus right now, on any browser, any device, you will find references to something called the Letter of Lentulus. It's cited constantly: Christian websites, popular books on biblical history, devotional materials. The letter purports to be written by a Roman official named Publius Lentulus, a governor of Judea, sending a formal report to the Roman Senate. And the physical description it contains is remarkably detailed. Jesus has hair the color of ripe hazelnuts, parted in the middle. His beard is full, divided at the chin. His eyes are blue-gray, serene and penetrating. His bearing is tall and noble. He walks with quiet authority. This is the description. This is what millions of people have cited as ancient Roman eyewitness confirmation of the image they already believe in. Here is what you were not told. The Letter of Lentulus first appeared in Florence around 1421 CE. It was published widely in Italy beginning around 1460 CE. That is, over 1400 years after the crucifixion. There is no Roman governor of Judea named Publius Lentulus, not in a single Roman administrative record, not in any inscription, not in any ancient source whatsoever. No governor addressing the Roman Senate would have written in the manner of that letter. It violates standard Roman bureaucratic procedure in ways that are elementary to any classicist. The scholars at NASCAL, the North American Society for the Study of Christian Apocryphal Literature, maintain a comprehensive entry on this document. Their verdict, and the verdict of every serious scholar who has examined it, medieval forgery. And when you look at the physical description, something becomes clear that should have been obvious from the beginning. The hazel hair parted in the middle, the divided beard, the gray-blue eyes, the noble, serene bearing. That is not a description of a first-century Galilean Jewish man. That is a description of an Italian Renaissance painting of Christ. The letter was not written to document what Jesus looked like. The letter was written to explain what the paintings already showed. Or, and this is the more interesting possibility, both the letter and the paintings were drawing from the same invented visual tradition. A tradition that had been building for centuries. Built not from memory, not from proximity, not from any surviving testimony. Built from necessity. The only authentic Roman record of Jesus' physical appearance? There isn't one. Not anywhere. Bart Ehrman, one of the most cited New Testament scholars in the field at UNC Chapel Hill, has noted explicitly that we have zero reliable evidence for Jesus' physical appearance in any contemporary or near-contemporary source. 0. The Josephus passage, the Testimonium Flavianum, contains no physical description in any version. Tacitus mentions Christus in his Annals, but describes nothing. The Talmudic references contain nothing that scholars consider historically meaningful. The honest answer to "What did Jesus look like?" is, we do not know. The Church never admitted this, because the image was doing too much work to surrender. You've been told what he looked like your entire life, but you were never told who decided, or when, or why. The assumption was always, running underneath everything, that somewhere in the chain between Jesus and your grandmother's picture, someone had been working from memory. Someone had seen a face, or spoken with someone who had seen a face, or had access to something real. That the image was preserved, not invented. The assumption, it turns out, was wrong. The decision was made by committees of artists in the 4th century. Artists who were working from pagan templates, serving the visual needs of an imperial religion that needed its God to look like God, meaning to look like power. There is no face in that chain that comes from anything closer to the actual man than theological convenience. Not one. Every link was an interpretation. Every interpretation was a choice. And the choices accumulated over centuries, each one pointing in the same direction. Not toward the historical Galilean, but away from him. Toward something the powerful needed people to see when they looked at divinity. You didn't choose that face. Nobody asked you. It was installed before you had words. The Dura-Europos church is worth spending some time with. It was a house converted into a place of Christian gathering. Located in what is now eastern Syria, near the Euphrates, the site was excavated in the 1920s and 1930s. The church has been dated to approximately 233 to 256 CE, within 200 years of the crucifixion. That is closer to Jesus than we are to Abraham Lincoln. The fresco I show in my lecture, the healing of the paralytic, is not the only image in that building, but it is the most significant for this conversation. The figure representing Jesus is young, clean-shaven, short hair. He wears a simple Roman tunic. He is visually indistinguishable from any ordinary man of his time and region. And that beardless, short-haired convention was not unique to Dura-Europos. The same visual type appears in the Roman catacombs, the underground burial chambers where early Christians gathered in the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE. The image there is called the Good Shepherd, a young man, clean-shaven, carrying a sheep on his shoulders. This is how the earliest Christian community chose to represent Christ. No long hair, no beard, no flowing robes, no halo of divine authority. Just a young man doing something human. The earliest Christian communities, people 2 and 3 generations removed from the eyewitnesses, had a visual tradition of a clean-shaven young Jesus. That tradition lasted for at least 200 years after his death. Then something changed. It turns out the change was not theological, it was political. Paul wrote it down in a letter dated approximately 55 CE. That is 20 to 25 years after Jesus' death. There were still people alive at that moment who had known him personally. 1 Corinthians chapter 11 verse 14. Does not nature itself teach you that if a man wears long hair, it is a disgrace for him? That is not abstract theology. That is Paul describing the visual norm of his world, the shared cultural assumption, the thing everybody knows without needing to explain. In Paul's community, the Jewish Hellenistic world of 1st century Galilee and Jerusalem, a man with long flowing hair would have been noticed, would have been remarked on, would have been associated with something specific. The Nazirite vow, the ecstatic religious traditions, the holy man set apart by deliberate transgression of ordinary male appearance. The Gospels never mention Jesus' hair being unusual. Not once. In 4 Gospel accounts, with detailed descriptions of his words and deeds and the reactions of the crowds around him, no one notes that he had unusual hair. Not one writer, not one witness, not one antagonist who might have used it against him. If he had looked like the Renaissance paintings, long, flowing, center-parted European, in the cultural world Paul was describing, that would have been remarkable enough to document. It would have marked him immediately as something specific. The Gospels treat it as completely unremarkable, which means it almost certainly was. The face on your grandmother's wall was not invisible in a Roman crowd. It was a European invention wearing Roman robes, placed in a Roman street, in a world that would have stared. So when did the familiar image appear? And why? The transition begins in the 4th century. The critical date is 312 CE. That is the year Constantine converted to Christianity. What followed is often described as the Christianization of the Roman Empire. It can also be described as the Romanization of Christianity. The faith absorbed the visual vocabulary of empire, and the empire's visual vocabulary for divinity was very specific. Jupiter, Zeus, the supreme deity of the Greco-Roman world. Bearded, commanding, hair flowing with divine authority. The face of power made theological. Art historians who study this transition are explicit about the borrowing. The long-haired, bearded Christ who emerges in the 4th and 5th centuries draws from 2 overlapping visual traditions. The first, the Greco-Roman divine. When you give Jupiter a halo, you have the foundational template of the Christ Pantocrator. The second, the Greek philosophical portrait type. In classical antiquity, long hair and a beard were the visual signs of a sage. Socrates, Plato, Pythagoras, all represented this way. Long hair and beard meant, this man knows things ordinary men do not. This man has stepped outside of social norms to pursue wisdom. An imperial Christianity that needed its central figure to be simultaneously divine and wise found in those two traditions exactly the visual package it required. By the 6th century, the Pantocrator type was established as the dominant iconographic standard. The most famous example, the Christ Pantocrator at St. Catherine's Monastery in Sinai. Encaustic painting on wood. Long hair, full beard, direct gaze, gold nimbus. It is simultaneously a Christian devotional object and a piece of imperial political art. God as emperor. Divinity as power. Jesus of Nazareth repackaged as the face of the civilization that had, 3 centuries earlier, executed him. I want to sit with that for a moment, because what happened between the Dura-Europos fresco and the Sinai Pantocrator is not a development of tradition, it is a replacement. The earlier, closer image, the beardless young man in a tunic, was not built upon. It was set aside, and something that served a different set of needs was put in its place. But here is where the trail deepens, because the images tell us what people wanted to believe Jesus looked like. And the Letter of Lentulus tells us what forgers needed people to believe. But there is a third line of evidence, one that doesn't ask what artists wanted or what forgers needed. One that asks, what does the physical data actually say? In 2001, a British forensic scientist named Richard Neave undertook a project that deserves far more attention than it has received. Neave was not a theologian, not an art historian, not a religious commentator of any kind. He was a medical artist at the University of Manchester with decades of experience in forensic facial reconstruction. He had worked with law enforcement and archaeologists across hundreds of cases. He approached this question the same way he approached any case. You begin with the physical evidence. You follow where it leads. You don't impose what you want to see. He worked with a team of Israeli forensic anthropologists. They obtained 3 first-century Galilean Jewish male skulls, recovered from archaeological excavations in the region where Jesus lived. Not claimed to be Jesus's, not related to Jesus in any way. Just 3 skulls from his time, his place, his demographic, the closest available physical evidence for what a man of Jesus's background would have looked like. The methodology was rigorous. Computerized tomography, CT scans, generated 3-dimensional cross-sectional images of the bone structure. A computer program modeled the soft tissue. Clay layers were built up according to tissue depth data tables derived from established forensic research. It was the same process used to reconstruct faces for cold case criminal investigations. The same process used to identify disaster victims, applied here to the most famous face in human history. The result was published in Popular Mechanics, December 2002. The face that came out of that study is not the face you know. Olive brown skin, short, tightly coiled dark hair, estimated from artistic and skeletal evidence of Galilean Semites of the period. Dark brown eyes, a broad, strong face with a prominent nose. Height, approximately 155 centimeters. That is about 5 feet 1 inch. He would have been short by the standards of any modern observer. Stocky, built for physical labor, the Gospels consistently describe him as a carpenter. Weathered from outdoor life in a region of intense sun. He looked, in short, like the people Rome had conquered. He had the face of the Galilean poor. Dark, compact, ordinary in his context. Invisible to Roman power in the way the poor are always invisible. I want to be precise about what Neave's work is and what it isn't. It is not a portrait of Jesus. It cannot be. No forensic reconstruction of three unrelated skulls from a region and period produces the literal face of a specific individual from that region and period. What it produces is a reasonable approximation of what a man of Jesus's background would have looked like. The range of plausible features, the statistical center of an appearance. And what it tells us, clearly and unambiguously, is that the probability of Jesus looking like the canonical paintings approaches zero. Not because of theology, not because of faith, because of bone structure and tissue depth and the physical realities of a first-century Galilean Jewish male. The face that billions of people have prayed to, wept before, carried as the center of their faith, was not derived from evidence. It was derived from Zeus, from Italian Renaissance painters who needed God to look like their patrons, from a letter forged in Florence in the 15th century. The Popular Mechanics article was widely read when it came out. It caused a brief, uncomfortable stir. And then the world went back to the paintings. Now pay attention to this. If the forensic reconstruction is approximately correct, and it is the only image of Jesus constructed from actual physical evidence, then Jesus looked like the people Rome had subjugated. He had the face of those who paid Roman taxes, who felt Roman authority in their daily lives, who worked with their hands under a foreign occupation that had no interest in their survival beyond their utility. He looked like the poor, like the laborer, like the person who would have been invisible to anyone of standing. The face the church gave him. Tall, pale, noble, commanding, is the face of the people who ran the empire, the face of authority, the face of the civilization that executed him. When missionaries carried that face to Africa, to the Americas, to Asia, they were not bringing the face of the man who walked through Galilee. They were bringing the face of his colonizers, rebranded as the face of God. You can trace, in the missionary paintings of conquered peoples throughout the world, the moment when sacred images began to wear that Italian Renaissance face. The moment when the divine was made to look like the powerful, for the convenience of the powerful. Every time you looked at the Jesus in your church and felt something faint and unnameable, the European face on the Middle Eastern story, the pale skin in the desert sun, the noble bearing among the conquered poor, you were reading something true. The image was not a portrait. It was a political choice, made centuries after his death, by artists who needed God to look like power. The man who actually walked through Galilee looked like the people power was walking over. You were not projecting. You were not confused. You were noticing. J.J. Benítez spent 40 years investigating the historical Jesus. 10 volumes, thousands of pages, more than 3 decades of research before the first Caballo de Troya was published. And throughout that entire body of work, the Jesus he described had the features of a first-century Galilean Jewish man. Mediterranean, Semitic, ordinary in his physical context, the face of someone from among the people the Roman Empire managed rather than considered. Benítez was not the first to see the contradiction between the historical man and the painted icon. But he articulated something about it that I've come back to many times. In his post-publication interviews and investigative writings, he described the canonical painting Christ as what he called the most visible and least examined of the church's constructions. Not the least obvious lie, the least examined. Because the image is always there, in the church, in the home, in the illustrated Bible, in the grandmother's bedroom. So present that it becomes invisible. So accepted that the question never forms. The first lie they told you, he wrote, was about his face. Not about doctrine, not about scripture, not about the Nicene Creed or the canon or the structure of the hierarchy. The very first thing. The face. Because once you accept that face, that tall, pale, noble European face, you've already accepted a set of assumptions about who God looks like, about whose features are closest to the divine, about which civilization's face belongs at the center of the sacred. The institutional church did not create that image accidentally. Or if it did, it recognized its usefulness quickly enough. An imperial Christianity needed an imperial Christ, and imperial art delivered one. This is not theology, Benítez observed. This is imperial visual politics dressed as devotion. I used to think that was too strong. I don't anymore. When I look at that Dura-Europos fresco, the beardless young man in a tunic, painted 200 years from the crucifixion, and then at the Sinai Pantocrator, 400 years later, I don't see a theological development. I see a replacement. I see the face of a Galilean laborer, rendered by people who still had some proximity to the tradition, set aside and replaced by the face of Zeus as emperor, serving the needs of a civilization that required its god to validate its power. That replacement has had consequences. It has had them for 17 centuries. We are still living inside some of them. At the end of that lecture, I close the laptop. Both images go dark. I let the silence sit for a moment. Then I ask, which one do you recognize? Every time, the students point to the Sinai Pantocrator, the long-haired, bearded one, the 6th century icon, the one painted 300 years after the earlier fresco. I know, I say. Neither did I, the first time. I pause. And yet the earlier one, the beardless young man in the tunic, was painted by people who still remembered something. I pick up my notes. I leave the room. I've never told that seminar what I think they remembered. Partly because I'm not sure I know. But I think about it sometimes. On the drive home from campus, watching the Indiana horizon flatten out ahead of me. I think about a man who looked like the ones being walked over, who moved through the world without noble bearing or gray-blue eyes, who would have been indistinguishable in a Roman crowd. I think about what it means that the faith built in his name chose, quickly, deliberately, early, to make him look like the ones doing the walking. And I think about the people who looked at that beardless young man in a tunic and saw, in that ordinary face, something worth recording, something worth preserving. On a plaster wall, in a converted house, near the Euphrates. 200 years after he was gone. Still looking for the right face. Still not quite willing to let him become what the empire needed him to be. I don't know what they saw in him. But I don't think it was Zeus.